On May 25, 2020, George Floyd was murdered during an arrest after police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for over 9 minutes. His death sparked nationwide protests against police brutality, with many protesters calling for the defunding of police. In the wake of these protests and civil unrest, the nation cried out for the officer's arrest and waited nervously for his trial. Throughout this entire process, the current state of the policing system and potential considerations for reform were on the forefront of Americans' minds. Many felt that the current policing and legal system was racist and unjust, and they worried that the officer would somehow get away with what most considered to objectively be murder. This was ultimately not the case, as Officer Chauvin was found guilty. However, the need for police reform still remains necessary, and protests continue on as activists demand change. These protests echo the efforts of civil rights leader and freedom singer Charles Neblett, who 60 years ago was fighting against the same type of racial discrimination that we still see in many modern cases of police brutality. The discussion of discrimination that was relevant so long ago remains so, as our nation explores different options of police reform to prevent police brutality. In this podcast series, we'll explore the issue of police reform from 4 different perspectives: those of victims and their families, police officers themselves, activist organizations such as Black Lives Matter, and those who may potentially serve as alternatives to police officers.
State of Minnesota plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, defendant. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty.
George Floyd is among many of the names that the American people have become familiar with in recent history. Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and numerous other African American men and women have been killed under what many claim to be police brutality, while others suggest it is merely police completing their job. This episode is going to focus on the victims of these shootings as well as their direct families and the role that the police system has played in their lives. My name is Jordan Henley, and I'm a biology student at the University of Kentucky, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen today. In the publicized cases of the shooting of unarmed black men and women, the victims are only characterized by the media. Anything beyond their behavior prior to their murder and any background valued as evidence is essentially ignored by media and law. One perspective into this is that many blame the actions of the victims for their own murder, and that no reform is necessary within the police system. In the case of George Floyd, his life only matters starting with a $20 bill and a pack of cigarettes, according to a BBC article entitled George Floyd, What Happened in the Final Moments of His Life. The story starts when Floyd purchased cigarettes from a local mart. The store owner in which Floyd purchased cigarettes from contacted police believing the bill he used was a counterfeit. It was reported that Floyd was supposedly drunk and not in control of himself. After resisting arrest, Floyd ultimately ends up dead under the knee of Derek Chauvin. In this case, many argue that Floyd was dangerous and Chauvin was only acting according to regimen. This perspective sees that there is not any wrong in Chauvin's actions, and rather, Floyd was at fault for not being compliant in his behavior. All this noted, the George Floyd case gets more complicated with the addition of another detail of the events on May 25th. Through looking beyond the initial instigation of the Floyd case, the distinction of who is at fault begins to blur. Many have come to believe that when police brutality cases are looked into further detail, the victims are not at fault, implying that the police system needs reform. In the same article published by BBC, it is reported that after the initial struggle and while Floyd was being restrained on the ground, he said that he could not breathe. He also pleaded for his mother and at one point gasps out, "You're going to kill me." When the case is looked into further, there is potential to blame the officers for being out of hand. This is where the controversy of many cases has arisen, as who is at fault is open for interpretation, but when details beyond resisting arrest, such as these, are looked into, it does appear that the victims are not at fault. In another infamous modern-day case, Daunte Wright is most likely not to be blamed for his own murder. Daunte Wright was shot after being pulled over on April 11th of this year. With an arrest warrant out for him, the situation escalated quickly until Officer Kimberly Potter shot and killed him after mistaking her gun for a taser. Many view this as an apparent flaw within the police force, seeing that officers aren't trained to the degree of being able to distinguish a taser from a firearm. Many have cited this example as a major red flag and have called for the police training standards to be improved. Beyond the actual victims of these serious crimes, the families of victims are often discounted beyond their initial reaction to the death of their relative. Many family members often express their sorrows with the death of their relative, and with this comes calling for reformation within the police system. In the case of Ryan Martinez, a black man who survived being shot by police officer Kyle Woods, who had also previously shot and killed an unarmed black man by the name of Nathaniel Pickett II. The expression of Martinez's family members makes the opinion very clear. While Martinez himself declined to report to major news outlets, his mother expressed her frustrations with the treatment of African Americans by the police force. She told of how her son was shot and tased at the same time, and that the police's role is not to harm, but rather to protect. In discussion with police psychologist LaMaurice Gardner and criminology professor Richard Rosenfeld, NPR unveils several cases where black men and women were harmed and murdered by police unjustly. The group arrives at the ultimate conclusion that the behavior expressed by several officers is very out of line and that policies must be changed. The article moves on to discuss how several police officers have been involved in many accounts of shooting unarmed black men and women, and that they are not being punished. Evidently, there are many frustrations among victims' families with how they have lost their loved ones in a case that they should not have. It can be seen why many have claimed that there are improper and ineffective training methods within the police system, and that it's crucial for the police system to be altered and rebuilt in some way to prevent future occurrences like those described from occurring. In respect to the several victims and their family members, it is very evident that in the typical case, it is not the victim at fault. Many family members often recognize this and call for a punishment for the relative's murderer, but the gray area of whether the officer was following protocol is where things tend to get hazy. Beyond this, there is no denying that this is an issue of the present. It seems to only get worse and worse in terms of the division present within the country, and with every new victim, this wound deepens. The problem at hand must be addressed by those in power, and a decision must be made to get things moving in the right direction. Through initiatives like voting, protesting, and contacting politicians, anyone can make their voice heard and recognized. In respect of the perspective of victims and their families, it is important that further stakeholders in this argument are addressed. Next up are the viewpoints of police officers.
No justice, no peace. Prosecute the police. No justice, no peace. Prosecute the police. No justice, no peace. Prosecute the police. No justice.
Although the Black Lives Matter movement started much earlier, summer 2020 was the height after George Floyd's death under the knee of former officer Derek Chauvin. We all remember the protests, marches, black squares on our Instagram feeds, hashtags, and petitions. It was clear how organizations, protesters, and people of color felt. Most of us probably even formed our own opinions. But what about the officers themselves? Hi, my name's Morgan Blank. I'm a freshman at the University of Kentucky. I'll be taking you through episode 3 of the Justice for All podcast. This episode will walk through how police officers feel about the policing system, and some points of view may be shocking. We often think of police as the opposing force. However, this may not always be the case, as they too see issues within the system. Many officers believe that the policing system needs reform and is only holding departments back. Officer Russell Melvin, for example, former district commander of the worst district in Baltimore City, most violent, most impoverished, and a 46% unemployment rate, gave a TED Talk about how reform is necessary to move forward as communities. Russell explains that when dealing with calls, his department had to go against all that they were trained to do. He says the department was trained to go about their duties as if they were separate from the community and held power over them. To move away from this, the officers had to shift their mindset from us versus them to us working with them. When this mindset shifts to thinking of two groups as one whole, everything changes. Looking at the rest of the community as fellow members and as equals instead of lessers motivates the department to work harder in serving them. He goes on to say that police forces focus so much on protection and power and tends to forget that they're designed to protect and to serve. They've invested so much in protection and have fallen short in serving their communities. For example, the department focuses so much on arresting drug dealers, but doesn't consider that these dealers could have turned to selling drugs as a last resort to provide for their families in times of unemployment. 45,000 people are incarcerated for nonviolent drug crimes. Those are people that would better benefit from rehabilitation, more job opportunities, and a loving community, not prison. The flaw in the system is the fact that the emphasis is on prosecuting drug dealers rather than considering their needs and meeting them. Another former police officer, Michael Wood, also had a lot to say about problems within the system in an interview with the Washington Post. He says, quote, "When you're working in policing, you're inundated early on with this us versus them mentality. It's ingrained in you that this is war, and if someone isn't wearing a uniform, they're the enemy. When all you're doing is responding to calls, you're only seeing people in these neighborhoods when there's conflict. So you start to assume conflict is all there is, just bad people doing bad things," end quote. What Wood is saying is similar to what Russell had to say about the system. It's designed to push an us versus them mindset. This is problematic because it is inevitable that one group will see themselves as superior to another, even though they all make up one community. If you think you're working against someone, you'll inevitably be more aggressive and competitive rather than if they were on your team. Officers are trained to deal with only the bad, so they start to see their fellow community members as bad people instead of equals who they're designed to protect. This brings us to the next standpoint. Of course, every single person in such a big group will never all have the same opinion. Although Officer Russell and Wood feel that there must be change, not every officer agrees. Some officers do not feel that the policing system needs reform, but just that the media has them misunderstood. In May of 2020, Minnesota citizen George Floyd was pronounced dead after former officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for about 9 minutes. During the trial this past month, Chauvin was charged with second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. However, many people argue that Chauvin should have been charged with hate crime. Barry Broad, a former officer, explains why this is not the case. Broad says, "I felt that Officer Chauvin's interactions with Mr. Floyd were following his training and were objectively reasonable. It's a challenge to put yourself in the officer's shoes and to try to evaluate what they're feeling, sensing, the fear they have, and then make a determination." This is a very common perspective amongst officers. People supporting this perspective say that officers have to think quickly on their feet, so accidents are bound to happen. Certain jobs within the police department are hard, fast-paced, and very traumatizing. It is hard to take on the mindset and imagine how they think. Broad also argues that there is no evidence Officer Chauvin was racist. Floyd just happened to be a black man. Although they are just one group, police officers hold many different viewpoints about the policing system and whether or not it needs reform. There's the viewpoint that the system is heavily flawed and needs rebuilt. The viewpoint that officers just have a hard job and are bound to make mistakes, and many in between. No matter what stake you hold, it's so vital to stay in the loop and be educated on the fight for police reform on all sides. This is not something we talk about in past tense. People are being killed every day at the hands of an extremely flawed system. The time for change is now and cannot be put off any longer. In episode 4, Peter's going to be covering activist organizations' views on police reform.
As problems within the policing system become illuminated by the tragic deaths of victims, stories told by the victims' families, and from police officers themselves, the call for change is led by activists and organizations working to resolve these issues. Hi, my name is Peter Schoenbachler, and in this episode we will be exploring the positioning of different activists and organizations and what these different positionings mean surrounding the topic of police reform. Beginning with the ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, they are an organization that has been at the center of nearly every major civil liberties conflict in the U.S. for over 100 years. In an ACLU podcast hosted by editor Molly Kaplan, she discusses the topic of police reform with activists Andrea Ritchie and Carl Taki. Ritchie is an attorney, author, researcher, and organizer, and Taki is a senior staff attorney for the ACLU's Trone Center for Justice. To begin the podcast, Kaplan asked Taki about his beliefs about defunding the police. Taki defines the goal of defunding the police to be reducing the footprints police leave on society by reducing their funding. Taki explains the idea of defunding the police by talking about the idea of divestment and reinvestment. He says, at the core of the movement to defund the police is the wish to reinvest that money into black communities that have been historically oppressed by the policing system. This reinvestment hopes to provide black communities opportunities in a society that they are so often left at a disadvantage. Taki continues his discussion on defunding the police by saying, quote, "This movement wants to narrow the scope of police responsibilities and create programs with specialists to solve problems such as mental health crises and drug abuse that current-day police work isn't equipped to properly handle," end quote. As you can tell, the reinvestment associated with the defunding of the police covers a wide scope from that of reinvestment into black communities to that of creation of programs to help solve problems that police are not properly equipped to handle. Madison will go into detail about these alternatives to police officers in a later episode of this podcast. Later in the podcast, Kaplan asks Richie about her beliefs about abolishing the police. Richie explains the differences between defunding and abolishing the police by stating that defunding the police seeks to reduce the footprints left by police officers on society, while abolishing the police seeks to simply get rid of their footprints. She states that defunding the police is a stepping stone towards abolition, but that abolition is necessary because policing itself is inherently violent and the entire system itself is the root cause for these injustices. She backs this claim with statistics that police cause 10% of gun violence each year, only 5% of arrests made each year are for crimes of rape, murder, or aggravated assault, and that in the past decade alone, every 5 days an officer is caught for an act of sexual misconduct. These statistics, along with what Morgan had discussed earlier in her episode about the police culture and the us versus them mentality, show the inherently violent nature of the policing system and why Richie believes that abolition is the only viable option. The next organization under discussion is that of Black Lives Matter. This organization has become almost synonymous with the movement for police reform. The Black Lives Matter organization runs a website called defundthepolice.org where they explain their beliefs on defunding and abolition of the police. The Black Lives Matter organization calls for a national defunding of the police and a reinvestment into their communities to provide black people the resources necessary not only to survive but thrive. They believe that although, quote, various jurisdictions have tried reform, training, and body cameras meant to hold police accountable, none of these measures have worked. The police keep killing black people, often without having ever to be held accountable, end quote. They believe that the only viable option is to defund the police and eventually abolish them. As mentioned by the ACLU, they also believed in the idea of de-investment and reinvestment and call for the investment in black communities with community support, jobs, education, housing, healthcare, and other services that deliver safety, security, and the prevention of violence. This information from the most prevalent organizations surrounding this issue can be interpreted differently, as people are already familiar with this organization and may have previously formed opinions, like those supportive of All Lives Matter or the previously discussed Blue Lives Matter, in a rebuttal to the Black Lives Matter movement. Although the means at which it is accomplished can be debated, one thing remains true in the eyes of activists: police reform is needed. Whether they believe in defunding and reinvestment, defunding and creation of alternatives to police officers, or abolition altogether, there's not necessarily an objectively right or wrong answer. Now, being familiar with the general ideas for reform, Madison is going to go in depth about some of the alternatives to police officers and break down the budgets of some of the city's police departments.
After hearing from the families of victims on what they're hoping to change about the police system, from civil rights organizations on their stance, and from police officers themselves, we'll now discuss the potential to replace traditional police forces with other alternatives. My name is Madison Boosveld, and I'll be discussing the issue of police reform from the point of view of police alternatives. These police alternatives have the potential to handle behavioral health and non-emergency cases in non-aggressive ways that lower the chances of the involvement of violence in such situations. To introduce this topic, we'll again return to the George Floyd case. Following his murder at the hands of police in May 2020, Minneapolis City Council members made claims that they plan to abolish the city's police force. Although this ultimately never came to fruition, the council did attempt to make some changes to the police force by altering the city's 2021 budget. The police budget was slashed by $12.5 million, and the number of officers on the force was reduced from 888 to 770. Apart from these changes, the council also allotted nearly $500,000 to continue its police co-responder program, in which mental health specialists respond to 911 calls regarding mental health crises along with police officers. This program has been in the works since 2017, though with the larger amount of funding it's receiving with the most recent city budget, it's expected to become permanent. According to Minneapolis City Council member Steve Fletcher, the program is resulting in, quote, a lot fewer arrests, a lot less use of force, and a lot of better overall outcomes, end quote. Alternatives to police forces, such as Minneapolis's Police Co-Responder Program, have been gaining an increased amount of attention following the surge in fatalities by police that have occurred over the past year. Many of these alternative options involve using social workers or mental health specialists. These types of professionals are specifically trained to provide support to those experiencing a mental health or behavioral health crisis. They have the ability to de-escalate tense and dangerous situations without the use of force and without the involvement of deadly weapons. Furthermore, many advocates of using mental health professionals believe that their services should be made available on a regular basis, not merely when a crisis is occurring. Many poorer communities do not have access to mental health services, both because they are personally unable to afford them and because there are no public resources made available to them. Shifting funding for police to providing accessible mental health care is likely to decrease the number of emergency situations that occur to begin with, as mental health issues can be addressed before they lead to potentially dangerous behavioral health issues. Advocates for defunding police forces also believe that police alternatives are optimal for use in non-emergency type situations. One prominent example is instituting traffic enforcement programs. Too often, Black people have been pulled over for minor traffic infractions that have resulted in police brutality or even fatality. Such was the case in 2015 in Cincinnati when an unarmed Black man, Samuel DuBose, was shot and killed after being pulled over for merely missing a front license plate. The officer at fault, Ray Tenzing, lied in a police report about being dragged by DuBose's car after he supposedly attempted to flee, although body cam footage confirmed that this was not the case. In instances such as these, fatal weapons are unnecessary and only put lives at risk. As opposed to the harsher measures taken by police, traffic enforcement monitors would have the power to conduct traffic stops and issue citations, though they would not be armed and would not be able to conduct searches or arrests. A lack of fatal weapons would lower the likelihood of violence occurring, thereby preventing the sort of brutality that some individuals face by police in these situations. Another example in which police could be replaced is within schools. This is another situation in which mental health specialists would be more appropriate, as well as school counselors. According to a study by the Texas Education Resource Center, the presence of police within schools results in a 1.7% drop in high school graduation rates, as well as less of a likelihood for students to attend college. Ultimately, mental health professionals and school counselors have experience with children and are well equipped to handle their behavioral problems. On the other hand, police are typically not adequately trained to address such issues with minors. Instead, their presence in schools represents more of a figurative threat of being arrested than a legitimate solution. Ultimately, redistributing funds that are typically allocated to police forces is likely to increase the overall health of a community by reducing the threat of police violence and by providing social services to those who otherwise do not have access to them. Prioritizing the use of police alternatives does not have to mean disbanding police altogether. In situations in which people, like mental health professionals, traffic monitors, and school counselors feel unsafe, officers can be used to provide backup. However, policemen do not need to be the first line of defense in these situations. Using police alternatives is oftentimes a pretty divisive issue. Next, we'll each discuss our perspectives on the topic of police brutality and give our opinions on what we think the best solutions might be.
Even before conducting this research, my opinion was that police reform was necessary in some fashion. Now, after conducting this research, my final opinion has not changed but rather specified. I agree that defunding the police is the best strategy, and I strongly believe in the investment in Black communities to provide them opportunities to be successful. Having visited the projects in Louisville and experienced the devastation of the Breonna Taylor case, I've come to realize how disadvantageous of opportunities people of color are given and how important this reinvestment is. In sum, I believe that defunding and reinvestment is the first and best possible action to take to begin police reform. Although I am not opposed to abolition, I do not see it being possible in the near future without first beginning defunding and reinvestment.
I agree with Peter that the best way to initiate police reform is to reappropriate police funding to instead go towards some of the other police alternatives I mentioned in my podcast episode. Specifically, I think that allocating more money to mental health professionals is the best way to go, as this will best benefit both individuals who are experiencing behavioral health crises and local communities who as a whole otherwise don't have access to mental health resources. Although I don't see police abolition realistically occurring anytime soon, as police presence is deeply rooted in our government, legal system, and communities, I think that it is important to diversify the many roles that police play to different professionals who specialize in these roles.
I strongly agree with what both of my peers had to say before me. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but I think defunding the police and splitting their jobs into many different ones is so crucial. Not only would this provide so many new jobs, it would decrease our spending on weapons and police training and leave more money to spend on hiring mental health professionals to deal with situations instead. My dad's a police officer, so at first it was kind of tricky to figure out where I stood on the issue. He works in the forensics department, meaning when people die, there are wrecks or domestic abuse, he goes and takes the evidence photos. He's also a crisis negotiator, meaning he talks people down from suicide when they're in a house barricaded about to hurt themselves or others, which, of course, doesn't always go the desired way. Carrying the weight of having to do this every night is way too heavy for one person and should be split into multiple different jobs. I think his job is very different from what people typically think a police officer does, and I have a lot of admiration for his strength after seeing the things he's seen. I think that can be said for a lot of the departments. They see more death, violence, hurt, and evil than most of us will see in a lifetime in 1 week on duty. However, that being said, we can't keep giving the officers the benefit of the doubt and must hold them accountable. Same with school shootings. We don't take bullying as an excuse to kill, so we can't keep letting people die and listening to the excuses about how the officer was overwhelmed. If their jobs are too overwhelming, even more reason to split them up. The system still stands on the same rocky foundation. Nothing can be built stronger until it's torn down altogether.
There is a clear and inherent issue with police brutality and corruption within the police force. While many are calling for immediate changes, I do not find this to be realistic. Instead, there should be a long-term plan for how the issue can be solved over a larger period of time. With smaller steps, there is more room for error if something doesn't work out, and while results may not be immediate, they are more likely to be in the bigger scheme of things. While I'm not necessarily sure completely defunding and eliminating the police force is the best option, their overall amount of federal budget should definitely be reduced. In addition, action should be taken upon the officers who are yet to be charged with murdering innocent men and women. Beyond this, training for officers should be reevaluated and reconstructed as well as modernized. There should also be more effort put towards mental health specialists and other initiatives that were discussed in Madison's episode. However, I do still see value in maintaining the police force because it is important to recognize that all they do is not necessarily bad, and in any given case, the bad always far overshadows anything good. We appreciate all of you taking the time to join us in looking into this modern issue. We know that times have been hard for several people and hope that with the information presented, you will be moved to act on the issue yourself. We would like to thank Professor Catherine McClain for providing us with an outline to complete the research and podcast, as well as the opportunity itself to conduct said research. Thank you for taking the time to listen and have a wonderful rest of your day.